Alright, here we go. So, it starts on a normal Saturday morning. My son, Derek, and I are sitting at the breakfast table, just chatting. He's a bright kid, always has been, and he's telling me about his mom's recent business lunches. I didn't think much of it at first. Vivian's always been a social butterfly. But then he says, yeah, Mom and Mr. Andre looked really happy to see each other again. Something about the way he said it clicked wrong in my gut. I asked him, real casual, so, who's Mr. Andre? Derek shrugged, saying, oh, he's Mom's new friend from work. They have lunch, like, a lot. The way he said, a lot, made my ears perk up. I kept it cool, but internally, it was like a switch flipped. I'd been with Vivian for years. She was everything, smart, beautiful, a little sharp at times, but still I thought we were solid. But now, Derek's offhand comments got me rethinking everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something just didn't sit right. I thought back to all those times she'd seemed a bit distant lately, making excuses about work calls and client meetings. That wasn't unusual in her real estate career, but the pattern felt off. The next morning, I made the decision. I needed answers, so I hired a private investigator. Once I decided to go the private investigator route, there was no turning back. My gut was right, there was something in the air, something that needed answers. I chose a PI named Greg, an older guy, no nonsense, the kind of person who wouldn't look at you with pity when you told him you thought your wife was cheating. He listened, took some notes, and asked a few questions. I told him everything Derek had said, down to the details about Mr. Andre. Greg nodded, saying he'd need a week or so to see what he could find. I didn't expect much that quickly, but the very next evening, I got an email from him with a subject line that made my stomach twist. Photos from Vivian's lunch meeting. I hesitated before clicking it open. When I finally did, I was hit with a series of shots that left no room for business interpretations. Vivian was laughing, touching Andre's arm, leaning in close enough to make it clear they weren't just discussing square footage. Greg had captured a whole sequence, Andre reaching for her hand across the table, the two of them strolling out of the restaurant, and her slipping into his car. In every shot, she looked like a completely different person from the one I thought I knew. The betrayal settled into me slowly, a slow-burning anger mixed with confusion. I felt like I was watching someone else's life crumble. The next day, Greg followed up with more. Apparently, it wasn't just lunch dates. They'd been meeting at hotels. It wasn't long before the work meetings became obvious lies, and as each lie unraveled, I started seeing all the other little pieces of the puzzle. Money missing from our accounts, unexplained expenses, purchases under my name that I'd never authorized. Something big was going on, and it was more than just an affair. 2 days later, Derek mentioned seeing my brother, Howard, and my old friend Rich with Andre at some fancy restaurant downtown. That threw me for a loop. Howard and I had never been that close, but it was still odd to think he'd be meeting with my wife's, whatever Andre was. And Rich. We used to be close, practically brothers ourselves. I hadn't seen much of him lately, and now it looked like maybe there was a reason. I asked Greg to keep tabs on all of them, see what he could dig up. I knew Vivian was involved in something deeper than just a fling, she had to be. And the thought of my own family and friends possibly being in on it? That was a new kind of hurt. Over the next week, Greg delivered more than I'd bargained for. Turns out, Andre wasn't just a slick real estate agent. He had a whole side operation running property scams, convincing people to invest in shady deals that he'd flip and leave them high and dry. And from the looks of it, Vivian was helping him, using her charm and her connections to get people to sign up for these can't-miss opportunities. Even worse? My own brother Howard and my old friend Rich were in on it too. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Howard and I weren't tight, sure, but we'd grown up together, shared family holidays, sat next to each other at every family gathering. And Rich? I'd pulled him through some dark times back when he was out of work. Now it looked like he'd used that trust and turned it against me. Greg found out they were using my name, my credit, my reputation, to sign off on deals without my knowledge. They'd file paperwork using my business info, slipping my signature into contracts and making it look legit. Vivian had access to everything, so it wasn't hard for her to make it all look airtight. One night, as I sat in the living room, staring at the pile of evidence Greg had gathered, Derek came in and asked if we could go for ice cream. I'd barely noticed how quiet and withdrawn he'd become through all this. I didn't want him to see how wrecked I was, so I forced a smile and took him out. As we sat in the car, him chattering about his friends at school, All I could think about was how much he'd be hurt by this, too. Vivian had been his world. He loved her unconditionally. I knew once the truth came out, he'd lose that same innocent belief in her. I had to play this smart, make sure he wasn't caught in the middle of whatever storm was about to hit. When we got home, Vivian was there, acting as if everything was normal. She asked us about our little trip like nothing was wrong. I looked at her, and it took everything not to confront her right then and there. But I knew I couldn't. I wasn't ready yet, and I wanted to see just how far this web of deceit went. The next morning, I called Greg and told him I needed to catch all of them in one go. I wanted one shot, no mistakes, no escapes. We'd build a case so solid it'd be like steel beams. With everything I'd learned, I knew I needed to play it carefully. Vivian was good at hiding things, and if she sensed anything, she'd bolt or destroy evidence. Greg and I put our heads together, planning a way to corner her, Andre, Howard, and Rich all at once. The plan was simple. I'd throw a dinner party, the kind Vivian always loved hosting. Only this time, the guest list was mine, and the agenda? A complete, blindsiding revelation. Over the next few days, I watched her closely, noting every fake smile, every little lie she spun without hesitation. Every time she said she'd be at work, Greg sent me updates, photos of her meeting with Andre, sitting too close, sharing quiet conversations over drinks, their heads nearly touching. The more I saw, the calmer I felt, strangely enough. I wasn't hurt or angry anymore. Just determined. I sent out the invitations, making sure to include Andre, Howard, and Rich, all under the guise of celebrating a big new contract I'd supposedly landed. Vivian didn't even ask questions. She just offered to handle the catering, almost excited to be the center of it all. She had no idea what was coming. The night of the party, I made sure every detail was perfect. I wanted them comfortable, unsuspecting, and seated right where I needed them. As the guests arrived, I could see Vivian floating around, laughing, playing the role of the gracious host. Howard showed up, shaking my hand with that fake smile, and Rich gave me a slap on the back like we were still best friends. Then Andre came in, dressed like he was the king of the world, all smooth confidence and charm. Once everyone had a drink in hand and was mingling, I waited for the right moment, then called them all to the table. "Thank you all for coming," I said, raising my glass. Vivian beamed at me, her eyes gleaming, probably thinking she'd pulled this off without a hitch. I couldn't help but give her a small smile back. Then I looked down, cleared my throat, and said, "I've been working on something big, a little project of my own. Thought I'd share it with you all tonight." I clicked a button, and suddenly the screen on the wall behind me lit up with a slideshow. The first image? Vivian and Andre, cozied up together outside some boutique hotel. The room fell silent, and you could hear a pin drop. I clicked again. Another image. Vivian signing a document in my name. Howard and Rich meeting Andre at some restaurant across town. One by one, I showed them everything. Contracts with my forged signature, money transfers, even some emails between them discussing the next steps in their little scheme. Vivian's face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Howard looked down, avoiding my eyes, and Rich just stared, stunned. Andre? He just gave me a slow, forced smile, like he thought he could charm his way out of this. I didn't give any of them a chance to speak. I turned to the side of the room, where I'd asked Greg to stand by, and nodded. Within minutes, FBI agents walked in, paperwork in hand, ready to take them in for questioning. The agents wasted no time. Within seconds, they had everyone separated and reading them their rights. As Vivian was led away, she looked at me, anger flashing in her eyes. "You set me up," she hissed, and I just looked back at her, calm as ever. "No, Vivian," I said quietly, "you did that to yourself." Watching her get led out in handcuffs, I felt a strange satisfaction, knowing that for once, the tables had turned. After the party was over and the agents cleared out, the silence in the house felt different. It was a relief. A heavy burden finally lifted. For the first time in weeks, I sat alone, took a long breath, and let it all sink in. Vivian was gone, Howard was out of my life, and Rich? He was just another stranger now. They were all facing the consequences of their greed and betrayal, and as much as I hated to lose the people I thought they were, I had no regrets. In the days that followed, everything moved quickly. The FBI had enough evidence to start tearing into Andre's entire network. Turns out, his operation was a lot bigger than I'd even realized. He wasn't just running scams on me, He'd been exploiting families, retirees, anyone he thought he could squeeze money from. And Vivian had been one of his most trusted partners. While they processed all that, I took the next steps. I wanted everything in my life clean, down to the last detail. First, I filed for divorce from Vivian. She'd already lost her claim to any of my assets, but I made sure to secure full custody of Derek. The court didn't even blink. It was obvious who'd put in the work to provide him with a stable life. Vivian had left a trail of chaos, and as far as the judge was concerned, she was out of Derek's life as long as I had anything to say about it. Howard, though, cutting him out was another kind of wound. He'd been my brother for 40 years, and now he was just another name on a list of people I used to trust. Family meant something to me, always had, but there was no way I could forgive this. He tried to bleed me dry alongside Vivian, and that was something I couldn't overlook. Then there was Rich. We hadn't been close for years, but it stung all the same. I'd called him brother for so long, shared moments, struggles. But now I saw his true colors, clear as day. I learned he'd been facing some financial issues of his own, gambling debts, and had turned to Andre as a quick fix. It was one thing to go down a dark path, but dragging me into it? Unforgivable. A few weeks later, I got a call from the FBI. They'd managed to get Andre to spill the full extent of his operation. He knew he was trapped and had started naming names. Turns out, there were other victims like me, people whose assets he tried to drain through the same fraudulent schemes. Vivian's role in the scam was the key they needed to nail him. She'd provided a bridge to people with money and had helped set up several deals, knowing full well what she was doing. As the court cases progressed, I realized that I'd been given a rare chance. I'd seen what real betrayal looked like, and I knew I couldn't just stand by. I reached out to the legal teams, shared every bit of insight I had on how Andre manipulated his victims, how the paperwork was crafted to look legit, how they'd preyed on trust and connections. The attorneys told me my input was invaluable. They were going to use every shred of evidence I'd uncovered to push for new protections against this kind of fraud. And so, I made another decision. With my background as a structural engineer, I knew how to build systems that lasted, systems people could trust. I started laying the foundation for a consulting firm, a place that would specialize in exposing corporate fraud, a way to help others avoid what I'd gone through. The idea that I could turn my nightmare into something meaningful, something that could protect other people, gave me a new sense of purpose. Once the divorce was finalized and the dust settled, life looked different. Derek and I had our routines, and I put all my energy into making our home a place of stability and comfort. He was young, but I could tell he understood more than I gave him credit for. Every now and then, he'd ask questions about why his mom wasn't around or why his Uncle Howard wasn't coming by. I kept it simple, telling him they'd made choices that weren't good for us, and he deserved a safe, happy home. At night though, when Derek was asleep and the house was quiet, I couldn't ignore the loneliness. Vivian's betrayal left scars I hadn't expected, and cutting Howard and Rich out of my life left a hole I felt deeply. Family and friends, my closest relationships, had been torn apart, and sometimes I questioned if I'd ever fully recover from it. Still, focusing on the consulting firm helped. I found a new sense of purpose in building something that would stand against people like Andre, people who thrived on manipulation and deception. I poured myself into research, late nights drafting plans, connecting with other engineers and consultants who believed in creating transparent, fraud-proof systems. Every call, every meeting felt like a step toward not only helping others, but also regaining a part of myself I thought was lost. About 3 months in, I received an email from a local business group asking if I'd be interested in giving a talk on corporate fraud prevention. They'd heard about my story through the legal channels and believed I could offer some insight. At first, I hesitated. Speaking publicly about everything was daunting, but then I thought of how many people like me could benefit. When the day of the presentation arrived, I walked onto the stage and looked out at the audience: business owners, investors, a few lawyers. I shared what I'd learned, how easy it was to ignore red flags when you trusted people, and the systems I designed to protect businesses from exactly that kind of exploitation. When I finished, I got more applause than I'd expected, but what struck me most was the line of people waiting to talk afterward. Some shared their own experiences with fraud, others asked for my help, and a few just wanted to shake my hand and say thanks. From that day on, the firm took off. Calls came in, contracts started rolling, and I found myself hiring a small team to handle the workload. It wasn't just about the money, it was about building something that mattered, something that helped people find the truth. And in that work, I started finding a new kind of peace. But it wasn't all smooth. A few months later, I got an unexpected message from Rich. He'd been released on a deal and was reaching out to make things right. He said he wanted to talk, to explain his side of things, maybe even apologize. I stared at his message for a long time, my mind racing with memories of the friend I'd once trusted with my life. In the end, I decided to meet him, not out of forgiveness, but to close that chapter, once and for all. We met at a small coffee shop near my office, and he walked in looking older, a bit worn out. He sat across from me, cleared his throat, and started with, "Sam, I messed up." His explanation was exactly what I expected. He'd been in financial trouble, desperate for a way out, and Andre had dangled an easy escape in front of him. He talked about regret, said he never wanted things to go this far, and tried to apologize. But I could see in his eyes, the regret was only half for what he'd done and half for getting caught. I listened, nodded politely, and then I told him we were done. For good. There was no rebuilding the trust he'd broken, no way to erase the damage. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left him there, feeling like I'd finally closed the last door on that part of my life. Walking out of that coffee shop after seeing Rich for the last time felt surreal. I didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel like I'd gotten closure. It was more like finishing a chapter of a long, difficult book. The truth is, no matter how much I'd wanted an apology, hearing his excuses reminded me that people like Rich would never truly get it. They'd never understand the damage they'd done. For weeks after, I focused on the business and on being there for Derek. The consulting firm had taken off faster than I expected. We were working with companies across the country, building systems to detect fraud early and prevent anyone from being exploited like I'd been. I threw myself into this work, finding comfort in knowing I was making a difference. Every success story, every company we helped protect, felt like a step toward real justice. Derek started to notice changes, too. I could see his confidence growing now that we had stability again. He took up baseball and wanted me to practice with him every weekend. Those hours tossing a ball back and forth became a kind of therapy for both of us, a quiet way to reconnect without all the questions I still wasn't ready to answer. He'd laugh as he missed my throws or managed to hit one out of reach, and in those moments, everything felt okay again. Then one Saturday, just as we were wrapping up practice, I noticed a familiar face in the stands. It was Greg, my PI. I hadn't seen him since the night of the party, but he'd been instrumental in getting the evidence to expose the scheme. Greg waved me over and explained he'd come to give me an update on Vivian, something I hadn't asked for but somehow needed to hear. She took a plea deal, Greg said, a little softer than his usual tone. Minimal jail time, but heavy financial penalties. She's pretty much lost everything. Hearing it, I didn't feel satisfaction or even relief, just a kind of sad acceptance. Vivian had built her life around appearances, around this image of success and wealth. Now that was gone, and with it, the family we'd once been. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them. Greg looked at me, as if assessing what I felt. "She's in a bad spot," he said. "But it sounds like you're in a better one." I nodded. "Yeah, thanks to you, Greg. Couldn't have done it without you." As Greg walked away, I looked back at Derek, still tossing the baseball up and down, waiting for me to come back. I realized in that moment that the storm had finally passed. The life I'd known was gone, but a new one was taking shape, a life built on honesty, resilience, and lessons I'd learned the hard way. That night, I told Derek a little more about what had happened. Not the ugly details, but enough for him to know that, in the end, we'd come out of it stronger. He listened quietly, his face serious, and when I finished, he just nodded and asked if we could go out for ice cream. We did, and as we sat there, talking about nothing in particular, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that we could both move forward, that maybe this new life would be better than the one I'd lost. With the firm thriving and my relationship with Derek stronger than ever, life was starting to find a rhythm again. But even with things going well, there was still a quiet loneliness that crept in at the edges. I'd poured so much into building my business and supporting Derek that I hadn't given much thought to my own life outside of them. It was as if I was waiting for permission to live again, not just survive. One evening, I was at a local business seminar, a small event hosted by a nearby university. I wasn't looking for clients. I was just there for a change of pace, to hear new perspectives. I was about to leave when I struck up a conversation with a woman named Rachel. She was an architect, passionate about sustainable design, with a straightforward, grounded personality that caught me off guard. We talked about our work, and she mentioned that her father had been a contractor. She'd grown up around blueprints and building sites and knew her way around structures in a way I could appreciate. We traded stories about difficult projects, crazy clients, and the odd joy of watching something you've designed come to life. It wasn't until she asked about my business that I hesitated, wondering how much to share. But something about her felt safe, so I told her the broad strokes of my story. I left out the heaviest details, but I didn't hide the betrayal or the journey of rebuilding afterward. She listened, nodding, her expression a mix of empathy and respect. When I finished, she didn't offer pity or a pep talk, just a quiet, "That must have taken a lot of strength." I hadn't expected anyone to understand, let alone a stranger, but she did. We exchanged numbers and agreed to meet up sometime for coffee to talk about a potential collaboration. But it was more than that. It felt like I'd finally met someone who saw me, not as the guy who'd been betrayed, but as someone who'd been through it and come out the other side. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I met a few times, mostly under the guise of discussing work. She showed me a project she was working on, a sustainable community center for underprivileged kids, and asked if I'd be interested in helping consult on the structural side of things. It wasn't my usual type of project, but it felt meaningful, and I was all in. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I'd missed having someone to share my life with. One evening, after we'd wrapped up a meeting and were sitting on a park bench with takeout containers, Rachel looked over at me and asked, "So Sam, what's next for you?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my firm and Derek that I hadn't really thought about what I wanted beyond that. I looked out at the trees, the leaves rustling in the evening breeze, and then back at her. "I guess more of this," I said, nodding to her and then at the sky. "Building something good, being there for Derek, maybe seeing what's out there for me. It's been a long time since I let myself think that way." Rachel smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Maybe it's time then." We sat there, comfortable in the silence, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift. It was small, just a seed of possibility, but it was there. I didn't know where it would go, and for once, I didn't need to. It was enough to know that after everything, life was still moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, there was more to look forward to than I dared to believe. As Rachel and I continued to work together on the community center, it became clear that this was more than a professional connection. I found myself opening up to her about things I hadn't shared with anyone. Stories about Derek, memories of the years I'd spent with Vivian before everything went sideways, and even my lingering anger at Howard and Rich. I talked about how I'd been rebuilding not just my career, but my entire life, piece by piece. One evening, after a long day of work at the center, we decided to grab dinner at a quiet Italian place nearby. The conversation came easily, and by the time dessert came, I realized I hadn't felt this comfortable in someone's presence in years. At one point, I noticed her looking at me with a softness in her eyes, something that wasn't just friendly. I felt my guard slip a little, that wall I'd put up for so long starting to crumble. "Sam," she said, almost hesitantly, "do you ever think about, letting someone in again? Really in?" Her question caught me off guard, but I knew it was coming from a genuine place. I'd spent so much time protecting myself and keeping my world small to avoid being hurt again. And yet, here was Rachel, asking me if I'd consider the possibility of a new beginning. I looked down at my glass, feeling the weight of my own answer. "I do," I said finally. "But it's hard to imagine letting someone in after everything. Trust isn't something I give easily anymore." She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "I get it. It's hard to risk that again, but maybe it doesn't have to be all or nothing, Maybe it's just one step at a time." It was such a simple answer, but it felt right. Rachel wasn't asking for a grand commitment or promises. She was offering something real, a chance to see where things could go without rushing or forcing anything. And for the first time, I felt like that was something I could do. After dinner, as we walked to our cars, I felt a pull, a quiet urge to make the evening last just a bit longer. She must have felt it too, because when we stopped by her car, neither of us moved to leave. "Well, thanks for tonight," I said, hesitating. Rachel just smiled, then reached up and kissed me softly on the cheek. "Good night, Sam," she whispered, giving my hand a gentle squeeze before getting into her car. Watching her drive away, I stood there for a while, realizing that for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live again. That simple kiss on the cheek, nothing more than a promise of possibility, stayed with me long after she left. It was like a reminder that no matter how broken I'd felt, Maybe I still had the capacity to hope, to trust, and to build something real again. As I drove home, I felt lighter, like some part of me had finally begun to heal. And in that quiet, in the darkness of the drive, I found myself smiling for the first time in a long time, ready to see where this new path might lead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new projects, coffee dates with Rachel, and little moments that felt more like a life than anything had in years. Derek noticed the changes too. He'd started asking more about Rachel, clearly curious about this friend, who seemed to be around more often. I could tell he was adjusting, trying to make sense of this new chapter we were both stepping into. One Friday evening, I decided to bring Rachel over for dinner. It felt like the right time to introduce her to Derek in a real way, not just as Dad's friend. I spent most of the day cooking, Derek's favorite spaghetti and meatballs, and a homemade chocolate cake for dessert. I wanted it to feel like a celebration, something new, something just for us. When Rachel arrived, Derek ran to answer the door, his eyes bright with curiosity. She greeted him with the warmth I'd come to know so well, kneeling to his level and asking about school, his friends, and his latest baseball game. I watched them talk, feeling a mix of pride and relief that Derek seemed to take to her right away. As we sat down to eat, Derek watched Rachel with wide eyes. At one point, he looked at me and then at her, a serious expression on his face. "Rachel," he said thoughtfully, "do you know about what happened with my mom?" I froze, wondering how she'd respond. Rachel met his gaze, nodding gently. "Yes, Derek. Your dad shared some of it with me, and I want you to know that I'm here for you too. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but if you ever feel like sharing, I'm a pretty good listener." Derek looked down at his plate, a hint of relief crossing his face. Then he nodded, like he'd just made some decision for himself. "Maybe someday," he said, quietly. Dinner continued with lighter talk, laughter, and the kind of easygoing connection I'd thought was lost to me. After we'd eaten and cleared the table, Derek asked if he could show Rachel his baseball gear. They disappeared into his room, and I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, letting everything sink in. When they returned, Derek was carrying his baseball glove, grinning as he asked Rachel to play catch with him in the yard. We all went outside, and I stood back, watching the two of them tossing the ball. Rachel laughed every time she missed a throw, her encouragement putting Derek at ease. In that moment, I could see the family we were becoming. I didn't need a picture-perfect life, I just needed this. A simple night, with laughter in the yard, and two people who filled the empty spaces I'd thought would never heal. As the evening wound down, Rachel gave Derek a small hug, and he whispered, "You can come over again if you want." She smiled, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I'd love that, Derek." When she left that night, I felt something deep in my heart shift, a hope that, just maybe, this new beginning wasn't just for me, but for Derek too. We were both finding our way back to happiness, one step at a time. After that night, Rachel became a steady part of our lives. She'd come over for dinners, join us for baseball games, and sometimes, the three of us would go out for weekend hikes. Derek seemed to blossom with her around, as if he felt he'd gained another person who genuinely cared for him. And for me, I felt a new sense of peace. But while I was opening up, a part of me still hesitated. Trusting someone again, truly letting myself feel vulnerable, wasn't easy. There were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if I could handle it if things went wrong. Rachel had a way of noticing this. She'd catch me staring off or getting quiet, and she never pushed, but I could see the gentle concern in her eyes. One Saturday, we were out hiking with Derek, walking along a trail near a small lake. Derek had raced ahead, his energy unstoppable, skipping stones across the water. Rachel and I strolled behind, and she reached for my hand, giving it a small, reassuring squeeze. "Sam," she started, her voice soft, "you know I'm here, right? I don't need you to be anyone other than who you are, and I don't expect things to be perfect." I glanced at her, taken aback by her intuition. She'd seen right through the wall I'd tried to keep up. But instead of feeling exposed, I felt understood. "I do know that," I replied, tightening my grip on her hand. "It's just, I've been careful for so long. I've built these walls because letting them down feels like too much of a risk." She nodded, her eyes softening as she looked out over the lake. "I get it more than you know," she said. "I had my own share of heartbreaks. It took me a long time to get here, too." She paused, glancing over to where Derek was still skipping stones. "But I don't want you to feel like you have to hold back with me. This is real for me, Sam." In that moment, something clicked. I could see that Rachel wasn't here to fill some temporary gap in my life. She was patient, steady, and willing to walk this path with me, no matter how cautious I was. I took a deep breath, feeling the last bit of that guard begin to fade. For once, I was ready to stop holding back. As we walked back to catch up with Derek, I felt lighter. It wasn't just Rachel's words but her presence, the way she was patient with me and with Derek, how she was willing to take things slow. I realized that if I was ever going to rebuild trust, this was the person who made it feel possible. Back at home that night, after we'd said our goodbyes to Rachel, Derek looked up at me. "Dad," he said, grinning, "Rachel's pretty cool. You seem happier when she's around." I ruffled his hair, smiling back. "Yeah, buddy. I am. And I think she likes being here with us, too." He nodded, satisfied, before heading off to his room. And as I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, I finally felt ready to let myself believe in something real again. Trust might take time, but for the first time, I felt like I was on solid ground, ready to take those steps. As things grew more serious with Rachel, I found myself reflecting on the past more than ever. Vivian, Howard, Rich, those names still had a way of creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I'd come a long way, but every now and then, old wounds would open up, bringing a wave of anger or sadness that I thought I'd moved past. I'd built a good life with Derek and Rachel, but there was one piece left to confront. One evening, after dinner, Rachel noticed my quiet mood and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. We took the path around my neighborhood, the sun setting, casting long shadows on the ground. After a few minutes of silence, she turned to me. "Do you ever think about reaching out to your brother?" she asked, her voice gentle. I stopped, taken aback. I hadn't spoken to Howard since the day he was led out of my home in cuffs, and frankly, I didn't know if I ever could. But maybe that's why his betrayal still haunted me, because there were so many unanswered questions, so much anger and hurt bottled up inside. "I don't know if I could forgive him, Rachel," I said slowly. "Howard knew me my whole life, and he still chose money and deceit over our family. I can't just act like that didn't happen." Rachel nodded, her hand resting on my arm. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Sam. But maybe facing him could help you let go of what's holding you back. Even if it's just to tell him what he did to you." Her words stuck with me, and after a few more days of thinking, I made a decision. I reached out to the correctional facility where Howard was serving time, and I arranged a visit. I didn't tell Derek or Rachel, because I needed to do this for myself, alone. The day of the visit, I walked into the sterile visiting room, heart pounding. Howard looked older, his face drawn and tired, and when he saw me, his eyes widened in surprise. For a few moments, we just stared at each other, the silence thick and heavy. Finally, I sat down across from him, taking a long breath to steady myself. "You know why I'm here?" I asked, my voice harder than I expected. He looked down, shame flickering across his face. I wanted to apologize," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did to you, to Derek, it's something I regret every day." I shook my head. "Howard, I didn't come here for an apology. I came to understand. You were my brother. You knew everything I went through, and you still chose to betray me. Why?" He swallowed, struggling for words. "I was desperate, Sam," he said finally, his voice breaking. I thought if I went along with it, I'd have a way out of the mess I'd made of my life. I didn't think about you, or Derek, or anyone. I was selfish." Hearing him say it brought a strange kind of closure. I realized that no explanation would ever make what he'd done okay, but hearing the regret in his voice, seeing the remorse in his eyes, it was enough. I didn't need to forgive him, but I could leave that anger behind, let it go so it wouldn't weigh me down anymore. "I'm moving on, Howard," I said, my voice calm. "You lost your chance to be part of our lives. But I hope you find a way to make peace with what you did." He nodded, looking away, and I could see he knew there was no going back. I left without looking back, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. Facing Howard wasn't about him. It was about reclaiming my life and putting the final pieces of this story behind me. That night, back home, I told Rachel everything. She listened, her hand wrapped around mine, her eyes full of understanding. "I'm proud of you, Sam," she said softly. "I know that wasn't easy." With that last chapter closed, I finally felt ready to focus on the future, on the life I was building with Derek and Rachel, a life built on trust, resilience, and a hard-won peace that I knew I could carry forward. After facing Howard, I felt a lightness that hadn't been there before. The anger, the betrayal, the lingering questions, they no longer had the same power over me. It was like closing a door on a dark room, finally stepping out into the sun. Rachel noticed it too. I was more present, more engaged. Derek even commented on it, saying, "Dad, you're different. Happier, I think." With things settled internally, I decided it was time to focus on building something lasting with Rachel. One evening, as we sat on my back porch after Derek had gone to bed, watching the stars, I brought it up. "Rachel," I said, a little nervous, "I want you to know that I see a future with you. I haven't felt this way in, well, a long time. You mean a lot to me, and to Derek too." She turned to me, her eyes warm. "I feel the same, Sam. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. You and Derek, this feels like home to me." Hearing her say that, I felt a flood of relief and joy. This woman, who had been so patient, so understanding, had become my anchor, my partner. And maybe it was finally time to make that official. A week later, I took Derek out for ice cream and, as casually as I could, asked him what he thought about Rachel becoming a permanent part of our family. He stopped mid-bite, his eyes wide. "Like married?" he asked, grinning. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy, like married. How would you feel about that?" Derek thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think that would be pretty cool. She makes you happy, and, well, she's nice. I like her." That was all the approval I needed. The following weekend, I invited Rachel to go hiking with me at a nearby trail where we'd shared some of our earliest conversations. We hiked to the top, where the view stretched out for miles, the kind of peaceful spot where you could see the world from a new perspective. As we looked out, I took her hand, my heart pounding. "Rachel, you came into my life at a time when I didn't know how to trust, or if I even wanted to," I began. "But you showed me patience, kindness, and understanding. You gave me back hope. I can't imagine a life without you, and I don't want to." Her eyes were wide, a smile starting to bloom on her face. "So Rachel, will you marry me?" I asked, pulling a small, simple ring from my pocket. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she nodded, barely able to speak. "Yes, Sam. 1,000 times yes." We embraced there on that hillside, the past and all its pain falling away as we focused on the life we were building together. A life defined by resilience, love, and a new start. As we walked back down the trail, hand in hand, I knew this wasn't just the end of an old chapter, it was the beginning of something new. For the first time, I felt like I'd found my way home again. After our engagement, life took on a new brightness. Derek was thrilled, constantly asking when Rachel would move in and brainstorming ideas for a wedding. He'd never been so enthusiastic, and seeing him so happy erased any doubt I'd ever had about moving forward with Rachel. Rachel and I spent the next few months merging our lives, moving her things into our home, making space for her in ways that felt symbolic of the new life we were all creating together. She was thoughtful about the changes, making sure not to overwhelm Derek with too much too soon, but every little addition, her favorite books on the shelf, her laughter filling the kitchen, the way she played board games with Derek on Friday nights, made the house feel like a real home again. One night, after Derek was asleep, Rachel and I sat on the back porch, enjoying the cool evening air. I looked over at her, feeling a surge of gratitude that was hard to put into words. "You've changed everything for us, Rachel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You've given us both a second chance. I don't know if I ever really thanked you for that." She reached out, squeezing my hand. "Sam, you and Derek are my second chance too. I was ready to give up on love before I met you. Being part of your lives has been a gift." I leaned over, kissing her softly, feeling that same rush of warmth I'd felt when we first met. We stayed out there long after the stars came out, talking about the future, sharing dreams I hadn't let myself think about in years. She talked about starting a design firm, one that would focus on sustainable architecture, and I shared my hopes for expanding my consulting business to make a real impact on fraud prevention. We talked about travel, about taking Derek to see the Grand Canyon and maybe even a trip to Europe someday. For the first time, I felt like the future was something to look forward to, not just something to get through. But as much as we were building something new, there were still old wounds that had a way of creeping in. The week before the wedding, Derek came to me one night, his face serious, and asked if his mother would be coming. It was a question I'd half expected, but it still caught me off guard. He knew I didn't talk much about Vivian, but he was old enough to know she was out there somewhere. "Dad," he asked quietly, "do you think Mom even knows about all this? Does she care?" I knelt down to his level, searching for the right words. Derek, I don't know what your mom thinks or feels these days. But I know that you and we've got a great life now. We're safe, we're happy, and we're together. And we have Rachel now, too. That's what matters. He nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a maturity beyond his years. I know, Dad. I just wanted to know if she even thinks about us. I hugged him tight, letting him feel the security that I hoped would outweigh any doubts or sadness. I think she does, Derek, in her own way. But you've got so many people who love you and care about you. Never forget that. He seemed to take comfort in that, and when he finally let go, he gave me a small, brave smile. I knew he was holding on to things he couldn't fully understand yet, but I hoped that, over time, our new family would fill those empty spaces. The day of the wedding finally arrived, a clear, warm day with blue skies and a light breeze. We'd chosen to keep it small, just close friends, a few family members, and of course Derek, who'd been proudly practicing his role as the ring bearer. We held the ceremony in a little garden near the lake where Rachel and I had first talked about our dreams and plans. Derek stood between us, beaming as Rachel and I exchanged vows, promises spoken quietly yet firmly, with a certainty that went deeper than anything I'd known before. After the ceremony, as everyone gathered for a simple reception, Derek surprised us all by giving a small, heartfelt speech. He stood up, holding a glass of apple cider, and with his young but steady voice said, "I just want to say that I'm really happy. Rachel, you make my dad smile like I haven't seen in a long time, and you're like a real mom to me. Thank you for loving us." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden, least of all mine. Rachel hugged him tightly, whispering something in his ear that made him smile even wider. As the evening went on, we laughed and danced under the fading sunlight, our friends and family gathered around in celebration. Rachel and I shared our first dance, swaying under the strings of lights we'd hung from the trees, a peaceful silence between us as we held each other close. Derek joined in too, his head resting on Rachel's shoulder as we danced together, the three of us moving in quiet harmony. That night, as the guests left and the house grew quiet, we sat together in the living room, just the three of us. Derek eventually fell asleep between us on the couch, his face peaceful, and Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand wrapped around mine. "Sam," she whispered, "we did it. We made it through." I looked down at Derek, then back at her, feeling a fullness in my heart that I hadn't thought was possible. "Yeah, we did," I replied, smiling softly. "And this time, it's for real." Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with tears, and we sat there in the quiet, holding on to each other and the life we'd built, a life born from resilience, forgiveness, and a faith in second chances. As I held my family close that night, I knew that the journey we'd all taken, the heartache, the betrayal, the healing, had led us exactly where we needed to be. For the first time in years, I felt complete. And I knew, without a doubt, that we were finally home. Life settled into a rhythm after the wedding, a kind of steady happiness that felt earned. Derek flourished in school, bringing home stories of new friends, baseball games, and science projects he couldn't wait to show off. Rachel and I built up our respective businesses side by side, supporting each other in a way that felt natural, like we'd been doing it all along. One Saturday morning, as we sat around the kitchen table, Rachel surprised us by bringing out a set of old maps, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I was thinking," she said, unrolling them with a grin, "how would you guys feel about a family road trip this summer? Just us, some camping gear, and the open road." Derek's eyes lit up immediately, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Where are we headed?" I asked, already feeling the pull of adventure. "Anywhere we want," she replied, leaning over the table. "We could go to the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, maybe even see some of the national parks. Just explore." The idea was perfect. It felt like the right way to begin this new life, together, making memories that were ours alone. Derek was already planning out the stops he wanted to make, tracing routes across the map as Rachel leaned in, laughing with him, her hand resting lightly on my arm. As I watched them, I realized how lucky I was. This was my family now, and every day with them was a step further from the past, a step closer to the life we were building. We had come through so much, and now with every laugh, every shared glance, and every plan for the future, we were creating something real and lasting. When Derek finally looked up, his eyes bright, he said, "This is going to be the best summer ever." I reached over, wrapping my arm around both of them, feeling grateful in a way that words couldn't capture. For the first time, everything was right. We were moving forward, together, one adventure at a time.